When I was in 8th grade, I signed up for my school's scholastic bowl team. And I didn't necessarily go to the biggest school when I was in 8th grade, and because of that, my scholastic bowl team wasn't the largest either. We often could only play with limited players, and in spite of the fact that we had a smaller team than almost everybody else, we still did really well. We made it into the playoffs, and while we didn't quite win the championship, we did pretty well throughout the season. This leads us into today's quote, which is, "It's not the size of the dog in the fight, but the size of the fight in the dog." I take this quote to mean that with enough motivation, we're all capable of winning a fight even if we're considered to be the underdog. This can be proven in three examples. First, through the popular literature series The Hunger Games. Second, through a smaller part of World War II known as the Winter War. And finally, through the popular short story The Most Dangerous Game. Moving on to our first point, we'll take a look at The Hunger Games. The Hunger Games is set in a post-apocalyptic America, in which the residents of 12 districts are brutally oppressed by their evil government known as the Capitol. Every year, the Capitol forces each of the districts to give up one teenage man and one teenage woman to go fight to the death in the Hunger Games. District 12, which is the home of the book's protagonist, is one of the poorest districts, and their tributes very rarely win the Hunger Games. Because Katniss, the protagonist, grew up so poor in District 12, she was forced to go hunt in the forest to provide food for her family. And because she did this, she learned very valuable skills. Most importantly, she learned how to hunt with a bow, as well as learning many useful survival skills, like what plants are edible and what aren't. And while Katniss went in as the underdog, as she was kind of small for a girl, she came in with very valuable skills, which helped her win the Hunger Games, making her one of the first tributes from District 12 to ever do so. This shows that even though Katniss went in from one of the poorest districts as the definite underdog, and she was for sure that she was going to be killed in the Hunger Games, she came out victorious due to the fact that growing up poor ended up being beneficial to her in the end. This relates to the quote, as it shows that it's not necessarily the size of the dog being the wealth of the district the tribute comes from, rather the skill that the tributes know, like Katniss knew how to shoot a bow and learn survival skills that helped them be victorious in the Hunger Games. Moving on to our second point, we'll take a look at the Winter War. The Winter War was a smaller part of World War II, and as many of you know, during World War II, the USSR and Germany were engaged in a war. During World War II, Russia needed as many possible paths as they could to attack Germany, and one of these paths was up north through Finland. Russia assumed that the Finnish would stop fighting and allow them to walk through their land to help them fight Germany, but the Finnish didn't. The Finnish put up the most valiant fight they could, and despite being a tiny country going against one of the largest countries in the world, they ended up being victorious. The Finnish used many useful skills. Because of the fact that Finland is so cold and the Finnish were used to fighting in that climate, they were able to use skis and maneuver harsh temperatures much easier than the Russians were. And because of this, they ended up wasting a lot of time and using guerrilla attacks on the Russians. Eventually, this wore on the Russians, and they eventually were forced to fall back, which was a humiliating defeat for the Russians, as you know, they're one of the biggest countries in the world and lost to Finland, a definite underdog in a relatively small country. This shows that it's not necessarily our size that determines whether or not we'll win in a war, but rather the strategies we use and our cleverness, like the Finnish. For example, the Finnish would go on skis and throw Molotov cocktails at Russian tanks, which would cause them to explode, which definitely demoralized and halted the Russian push. Moving on to our final point, we'll take a look at the popular short story The Most Dangerous Game. The Most Dangerous Game takes place in the past, and our main protagonist is a hunter. This hunter ends up getting into a boat crash, and he ends up stranded on an island, and he finds a strange person who lives on the island. This person, he finds out, is also a hunter, but unlike our protagonist, this hunter likes to hunt people rather than animals. Because the protagonist in The Most Dangerous Game was a hunter himself, he knew many of the skills that his hunter would try to use against him, and use that against his hunter. And our protagonist ends up surviving 3 days in the wilderness simply because of the skills that he learned while hunting. And he ends up hunting the hunter. This shows that it's not necessarily our size that helps us that our size that helps us be successful, but much rather our skills, as proven by the most dangerous game, as our protagonist ends up using his skills that he learned while hunting in order to survive and be more successful in the long run. In conclusion, I've proven that the quote, "It's not the size of the dog in the fight, but the size of the fight in the dog," means that with enough motivation we can win a fight that we're considered to be the underdog in. This was proven in 3 ways. First, through the Hunger Games. Second, through the Winter War. And finally, through the most dangerous game. And even me, when my school scholastic bowl team won, even though we were smaller than most of the other schools.